Our book begins with a picture of a subtext of modernity. Underneath the pavement, the cities, and the nation-states, there's an enduring network of indigenous people, approximately 370 million people. These people are found on every continent in varying numbers, and all have had to endure their discovery by other people who established control to varying degrees over indigenous territories. As our authors put it, quote, "Today the entire inhabitable earth is under the jurisdiction of state systems. Consequently, tribal peoples are no longer autonomous. They are ethnic groups with varying degrees of self-determination within modern states. They have been changed by their interaction with dominant cultures, but they are very much alive." Of this network, approximately 2/3 of the people have been estimated to be cultural traditionalists to some extent, though that data is very tenuous. There are many reasons that tribal people would not self-identify as traditionalists, that is, as people who practice indigenous religions, including the fact that many are also Christians who participate in Catholic and evangelical denominations that denigrate traditional practices as unchristian and potentially evil. So there is a certain politics to whether or not one might be attending prayer ceremonies in terms of who and where you might relate those practices to. As epitomized by the case of traditionalists in Africa, 90% of the population of Africa identifies as Christian, and only 10% are characterized as African traditionalists. Such was the power of the European slave trade and the scramble for Africa, and that's the name for what happens around the 1880s, and the scramble for Africa divided the continent of Africa between European powers. And so if you've heard phrases like the Belgian Congo or Rhodesia, Rhodesia is the name of Cecil Rhodes turned into a nation state. So that's part of that scramble for Africa. Europeans successfully enough marked that up into nation states, and with the Europeans came the Christianity that results in a contemporary world where 10% of Africans are traditionalists. Now, our authors maintain that there are reasons to be optimistic about the future of tribal religions. These indigenous religious practices have been displaced as the tectonic plates of early colonialism continue exerting their weighty pressure over the lands where indigenous people nevertheless continue to cultivate their pre-modern relationships to the land while negotiating with the tools and the worldview of modernity. So let's have a look at a nearby example of this kind of reality. Superman is a musician, artist, rapper who works with the tools of modernity even while he preserves traditions from pre-modern cultural practices. So let's go big, and Superman is from the Crow Reservation. This is a Billings Gazette clip.
I pray for the feel like giving it right now. I pray for you. Pray that you come, that you understand. For the pastors and all of the churches and those who cry like song following hearses. Can somebody help me up? Who?
So you guys can go find Superman if you'd like to listen to any of his other work. I thought that was worth the time. So, Superman, and as you saw at the end, he's got his badge that says USDA, right? So that's that indication of the authority that the nation state has. And then, but his name, Superman, underneath it. And he asks at the end, can somebody help me get up? And he completes it with a ho. Also, you saw him mixing on the table there with a record album of traditional singing. Our authors write, nothing that transpired in pre-modern times matched the dislocation of indigenous peoples that ensued from sustained contact with European states in modern times. So in that pre-modern world, of course, we have dynamic, changing traditions. We have people impacting each other. We have violence. We have territory wars. We have everywhere you have such mixtures. You have wives who move into new traditions and they bring with them their old traditions. But modernity marks an asymmetrical level of power involved in that, in those contact interfaces between cultures. Now, since we understand that one of the primary elements of religious traditions, according to the definition of our authors, is their worldview, we can thus see that European empire building over 400 years across the globe exerted an impact on religious worldviews across the globe. You cannot arrive with all the power and the glory without also impacting that cultural landscape, the religious worldview, both of the people arriving who are encountering something new and therefore impacted, their horizons broaden, and those people who are being encountered have their worldview being can-opened. The political and the religious meet at the interface where a conquering power exercises its dominion over other people's worlds. And in the case of European colonization, arriving with the European Christian God and the sanctions of the doctrine of discovery to enslave all heathen and to take control of all lands. And I've referred before to the doctrine of discovery, and I recommend you, if you're interested in that history of documents where Christian churches, Catholic and Protestant, declared that it was God's will to enslave and take the resources of other people. That's what that's all about. So these are the tumblers of Christianity's religious history that continue to move in our contemporary world. There are tumblers happening in the Soviet Union regarding not only Orthodox Christianity and the indigenous Siberian traditions, but also then communism's total critique of religion and oppression of religion. If you think about those tumblers as gears whereby an overwhelming military might of the conquering centralized states was plowing into the worldviews of indigenous peoples, then the question becomes, what happened at those interfaces? This is a question about how do we analyze the power of an asymmetrical contact event. Now, our authors provide three paired terms for understanding the interfaces where modernity plowed into the territories of indigenous peoples. The first is the most destructive edge of that encounter. Destruction and deculturation is that pairing. This includes, quote, the death of millions of tribal people and the destruction of entire societies and religious worldviews. Now, in Wyoming, that might be best represented by the removal of the Sheep-Eater Indians from Yellowstone. Gone. Between the Sheep-Eater War of 1879 and the removal of all Indian people from Yellowstone National Park, their world was destroyed. Also consistent with these dynamics was the decimation of the Crow from 20,000 people to 1,250 people over the course of 4 waves of smallpox, for which they had no immunity. So these are the kinds of, just think of those gears turning that characterize the destruction and deculturation of people. When you lose that percentage of your people, you are losing elders, you are losing political and religious and spiritual leaders, you are losing mothers and grandmothers, and it leads to a deculturation. Now, as our authors point out, the issue is not that urban centers are the only people who act violently in the encounter with others, but it is a matter of scale. Quote, compared with centralized state systems, like a U.S. government, however, violent tribal behaviors were limited in magnitude. The technology of violence has been perfected in the 20th century. That's from page 61. And so not only through colonization, but by the time we've hit the 20th century, those urban centers have perfected violence in ways that allow the exaction of violence at scales that tribal societies never experienced. Now, the next pairing of dynamics that describe what happens at the interface of tribal peoples in modern states is assimilation and acculturation, where assimilation is the absorption of indigenous people into dominant states and culture, which they argue, quote, has been the most persistent aim of modern states. That's page 61. They characterize assimilation as, quote, a subtle and benign form of cultural genocide. So the assimilation policy can be characterized by the phrase, kill the Indian and save the child, which was part of the motto of the Carlisle schools, the schools to which American Indian children were removed from their families, brought to the schools, so that it's a subtle and benign form of genocide. Kill the Indian, save the child. Right? There's quite a bit of tension in those mutual aims. Now, we live in very interesting times in terms of the academic study of power relationships. The second term of this pairing, acculturation, is a sign of our times. Acculturation highlights the mutual impact of two cultures at the interface of their encounter. A Catholic priest with a bearded stole, or a Buddhist monk who continues the prayer traditions of a Mongolian minority, are some of the markers of acculturation. The interface is not one-sided encounter, but rather every moccasin-wearing kid, every Boy Scout, every turquoise necklace speaks of the mutual influence of this encounter. So our times, we are not so interested academically in describing oppressor and oppressed, as we are watching the dynamics of that interface whereby influences are mutual. Asymmetrical, but nevertheless, there are mutual impacts. Now, finally, our authors describe the work of adaptation and revitalization that occurs for tribal peoples who have undergone progress and survived to tell the old stories once again. So revitalization is at work everywhere that one sees traditional practices carried forward as powerful and efficacious practices for our time. Scholars divide these revitalization efforts between restoration movements which, quote, restore traditional ways and expel alien elements, on the one hand, and accommodationist movements on the other, that integrate the old and the new. Hardcore American Indian traditionalists will reject Christianity as an alien tradition, whereas accommodationists see it as a vital part of many American Indian communities and therefore not to be thrown out, but rather improved by adding the full respect due to the traditional ways. So, if those are the categories, how would you evaluate Superman's performance? Thanks for listening.